Welcome back to Inflation Decoded and Explained, our little crash course on inflation. Last week we got the 2021 yearly CPI data, the Consumer Price Index inflation data. The number was 7% and the reaction was relatively relaxed. It was not that there was great turmoil in financial markets or business executives being absolutely scared about this. I would say it was a relaxed reception of this, what I think, very traumatic number, 7%. And why traumatic? I'm going to show you a little bit about the 70s, a period that I think you should know about when preparing for inflation. Why are they relaxed? I think there's another virus around, and I always call it the EPT virus, which stands for the excessive positive thinking virus. Excessive positive thinking, you just believe everything is gonna be fine. It has been fine in the last 10 years, so it's gonna continue. And that typically is a big problem in risk management because it leads to collective unpreparedness. And I want to help you not to be caught by this virus. So let's look back in the 1970s. And I don't want to scare you. I want to inform you so you can make, hopefully, good decisions for yourself. In the 1970s, or I should say 1960s and 70s inflation crisis, we had three peaks. And let's quickly go through these three peaks. The first one was from 1966 to 1969. CPI went up from 3.5 to 6.2. That was roughly something like this. Then central banks reacted and inflation came down and everybody thought, great, we beat inflation. Okay, so inflation came down to like 72. It was in the range of 3.4%. And then something happened. The big inflation shock from 1973 to 1974. And that took us to 12.3%. All the way there in 1974. Traumatic time. S&P 500 lost half of its value back then in 1.5 years roughly. And unemployment shot up, there was a recession, and everybody was scared about inflation. Now central banks reacted, and but then they relaxed very quickly, so inflation dropped to 1976 to something like 4.6%, 4.9%, and then it came back because central banks and politicians relaxed too early. Inflation wasn't beaten yet. And therefore, it came back. And at one point of time, between 76 and 1980, it went as high as 13%. And then a new Federal Reserve chair, Paul Volcker, was really determined to beat inflation. And in the following years, after 1980, he succeeded to bring it down to more normal levels again until 1982. It dropped dramatically. So we had three peaks. Now, just in comparison, I want to show you what the Federal Reserve back then did in terms of the federal funds rate as one indicator. There are many indicators in terms of interest rates, but I think it's interesting to look at the interest rates response back then. And I picked the federal funds rate for comparison purposes. So the first peak, 66 to 69, the federal funds rate went up by 475 basis points. It actually reached a level of around 9.2%. So in percentage points, interest rates went up 4.75% roughly. So quite a good response by the central bankers, and it brought inflation down but not enough, because we knew it came back in 1973 to 1974, and this time the federal funds rate went up 780 basis points. And then the same thing happened. We relaxed too early and inflation came back even more dramatically, reaching 13%. And what happened under Chair Volcker back then? Well, federal funds rate went up by more than 1,700 and it went over 20%. That was quite dramatic. Keep in mind, we are practically at zero right now. So we went to over 20% in the top of the federal funds rate. So that was the reaction, actually, the last one, that beat inflation. And then for the next 50 years, basically, we didn't have an inflation problem until now. Until now that we have the 7%. But again, nobody is concerned about it. And it reminds me a little bit of the 66 to 69 period. Inflation went up to 6.2% back then. And people were like, well, it's okay. We're gonna have it under control. Now, when you look at the responses today in business television, they talk about 100 basis points next year, interest rates going up. When you look at history, 100 basis points, I don't think is doing anything to inflation. Yes, we might get a little blip down. That's possible. It's never a straight line in history. Even during the German hyperinflation, there was a period when inflation came down and everybody was like, ha, we beat it. But we didn't back then. And we ended up in total hyperinflation and the surrender of the currency. So 100 basis points, I think, is way too little to solve the inflation problem. There's more to be done. Now here's the problem. We have much more debt today than we had back then. So here is one figure that I picked out. In 1972, the government debt to GDP ratio was about 33%. Okay, where are we today? quarter three of 2021, where are we now? We're at 122. Cannot even put it on this graph, I would be up on the wall there. This is much more of a problem today. We have record indebtedness in absolute and relative terms. And that's the key issue in fighting inflation, because when we raise interest rates like we did in the 60s and 70s, that's not possible, because a lot of people will get, and companies will get into big trouble, and also a lot of countries. Imagine in Europe, if we put interest rates up with these heavy indebted countries, it's almost impossible, and that's the big problem nobody talks about. And I want you to be aware of this. That's one thing that we have to keep in mind, and I don't know the answer to it. I pointed this out already 2016 in my book, The Return of High Inflation, and I mentioned it, that this is a problem we're gonna run in, and we might not have the interest rate tool to fight inflation. So here are some lessons learned for today's little session. First of all, don't think of an inflation problem as a problem that's gonna be solved within months. Don't get trapped by the EPT virus, the excessive positive thinking. You need to think about more like years. This is a fundamental, almost tectonic problem that we're facing in the world, with excessive monetary easing over a long period of time, stimulating a lot of indebtedness. So we're gonna have this problem more for years than for months. Keep in mind, this was almost 15 years, this cycle in the 60s and 70s, until Volcker brought it under control. Lesson number 2. If we really want to fight inflation, we need massive interest rate hikes, and nothing like 100 basis points or something else that you hear on business television. And I don't think that people are aware of this. That could be a massive implication. And if you do it, lesson number 3, before we have the nice time again, when inflation is behind us, will have massive pain. We will have massive pain before the healing. Now again, I don't want to scare you. I just want to share some opinions and facts and points I laid out in my book already in 2016. We are now exactly in that problem that I foresaw in 2016 when I published my book. Learn from the 70s. That's the most important recommendation I always give. We didn't have inflation for 50 years. So anything we look at for the last 50 years doesn't really help us that much. The last big inflation problem was here in the 60s and 70s. And there were similar situations. Thank you very much. Again, if you like the little instructional or information I give you in my videos, subscribe. I'm happy to welcome you in this network, and I will publish more. There were some questions about safe havens that I'm gonna make a video about this, and that's one of the next ones. If you have another topic you want me to discuss, I'm happy to do so. Just shoot me an email or a comment, and I hope this helps you, and I wish you all the best in preparing for the inflation problem we are facing in the years to come. Thank you very much.